Hello and welcome to week 3 of Positive Psychology. This week we are going to be talking about research methods, about how to use psychological research, how to design different types of research, some of the components to think about, some of the considerations, and an example of research in action. But first of all, to take a minute to get centered, I love this exercise. It's really, really simple, really easy to remember. It's great for kids to calm down and take a beat. So hold up your hand and you're going to be tracing your fingers. So up your pinky is an in breath, down is an out breath. So that's going to be 5 breaths total. So let's go ahead and do that. In, out, in, out, in, out, in, out. And ending with your thumb, breathe in and out. So that's great for calming your nervous system down a little bit and getting ready and open to learn. So first we're going to talk about using psychological research. Positive psychology is not a research course. So our intention with this module is for you to become an informed consumer of research. So you are more likely to be applying someone else's research really than conducting your own, but we want you to kind of understand the background, how research studies are designed, what you might be looking for, and some things to think about as you're going through and using other people's research to then apply to your own positive interventions or different types of applications, both in your personal life and possibly in your work going forward. If you remember last week, I mentioned this study. So Dr. Alejandro Adler, who became a doctor once he wrote this dissertation, he had a hypothesis that teaching skills of well-being alongside traditional academic subjects would increase academic performance in students. And so that's a pretty broad generalization. In his paper, he did come to the conclusion that it was both desirable and feasible, regardless of social, economic, or cultural context, to teach well-being in parallel to academic subjects because it increases achievement and performance in students. So how did he get there and why should we believe him? You are welcome to go ahead and read the whole paper. It's 110 pages. I've read it. It's really interesting, but it gets pretty deep and pretty specific into the actual pretty lengthy studies that were conducted. And so one of the ways that you can get a really good feel for a research paper or article is to read the abstract. So the abstract is a summary that's going to be right at the beginning of the paper. It's usually a paragraph or maybe 2 paragraphs. And you can see here that this is a long paragraph, just glancing at it, lots of numbers in it. So what Dr. Adler does is kind of describes the different studies that he performed and the methods that he used, some of the variables that they were looking for in those studies, and then a summary of his conclusion and what, that the results do in fact suggest that teaching, that it is possible to teach well-being and increase academic performance. So this is a little bit easier to read. These are kind of the beginning and closing sentences. This is his question: can well-being be taught at a large scale, and should it be taught in schools? does teaching well-being improve academic performance? So that's his hypothesis, is that it should, it can, and it does. And so his conclusion brings together 3 different studies that he did that had a lot of participants in those studies. But the conclusion of perseverance, engagement, and quality of interpersonal relationships emerged as the strongest mechanisms. So those are some of the variables that they looked at, and those were the mechanisms that had the highest correlation in how we can increase well-being, and how it's improved, how it improves academic performance. So you can get a lot of information from the abstract, but if you really want to get into it, you can read the whole entire study. Not all of them are 100 pages long. So one of the things that we have to think about in positive psychology in terms of research, positive psychology aims to understand, research, and then cultivate human flourishing. So we have to kind of understand and define what all of these components are, and then research and figure out, how do they correlate, or how do they contribute to well-being. So think about all of these different components of well-being and how you would define them. So it's important to have an operational definition of your concept or your variables, so that you know then how you can measure them. So we did a couple of assessments last week where we were measuring positive and negative affect and subjective well-being. So those are a couple of assessments that have been researched and validated. So let's take a look at some of the methods. You had the opportunity to watch some videos about this, which I think are really, really helpful with some great examples. So really what I want to do here is just review them really quickly, and then you'll have these slides kind of as notes to refer to. So most of us, if you took Psychology 101 or had any kind of science class, probably bio or chemistry in high school or in other parts of your college career, describes the scientific method. So that's the stages of the research process that you kind of have to go through to get valid results at the end. So the first step is observing and asking questions, and that's where you start to get really curious about things that you might want to learn more about, like, I wonder, do having pets contribute to well-being? So you then have this hypothesis that I think they do. I have 3 cats, and I feel they do contribute to my well-being. So I would then go ahead and do some research, do a literature review. You have in the module, there are links to all the databases that Gateway has specifically for psychology. So you have these tools at your fingertips to be able to research. So I could go ahead and do some research to find out if anyone else has studied whether or not pets contribute to well-being. And based on that, I could really kind of refine my theory about it, and then make sure that I can break it down into a set of testable predictions. So what is it exactly about owning a pet that contributes to well-being? I think, it's having a relationship with another living being that is reciprocal and beneficial. So I'm going to test that out in some way. So we'll go ahead and design an experiment to test this. And then once we have some data, we're going to go ahead and analyze that data. There's some statistical models that we can use that can help us describe the data that we have and kind of present it so people can understand it. And then also to determine whether or not, just because if we did the experiment, including me, because I have increased well-being from having pets, can we generalize that to a greater population? And then, of course, we would want to be able to share our results. It's important if you're intending to publish your results in some way, they need to be peer reviewed. That's really important in the scientific world in terms of presenting research. It needs to be peer reviewed so that your peers take a look at it, they agree with it, and also that it's reproducible, so it's not kind of just a one-off chance experiment. Keeping in mind that any scientific theory is falsifiable. It's kind of easy to use the data to tell whatever story it is you want. And correlation is not causation. So just because two variables are shown to have a relationship with each other doesn't mean that one relation or one variable is the cause of the other. And then one more thing to kind of keep in mind as you're interpreting your data is to avoid selective windowing. So you can kind of make your data set smaller to look only at a certain set that supports your hypothesis. So you want to be careful not to do that, but to be really objective about it. So the two measures of really good scientific research are reliability. You want to make sure that what you've done is consistent and reproducible, and you want to make sure that it's valid, that it actually measures what it's supposed to measure. So you'll hear those two words quite a bit. They're very important to keep in mind. So looking at research design itself, some of the components, some of the vocabulary and concepts that you'll want to get familiar with. Variables, those are the factor or factors that vary. So what are you trying to measure? And one of the examples that they gave is test scores related to drinking coffee. So the test scores can vary, and the amount of coffee that people drink can vary as well. And does one of those variables have a relationship with the other, either negative or positive? So the relationship between variables can be positive, where they support each other, or it can be negative, where if one variable shows up, the other tends to go down. A population is the defined group of interest. So in my pet example, that would be pet owners. We obviously can't measure all pet owners in the world, so we would be able to use a smaller sample that's a representative subset of the group. We would probably want to have a control group, which would maybe be people that don't own pets. And so we could take a look at some differences there. And then I mentioned earlier operational definition. You always want to make sure before you start designing your experiment or your research that you have a really specific description of how a variable will be measured. The types of research are these three: descriptive. So it describes or summarizes the characteristics of a group or phenomenon being studied. Sorry about that typo. That means, do we want to know what the average test score is? And so we would gather all the test scores together, and we would be able to describe and summarize the characteristics of the group by the distribution of the grades. A correlational study looks at relationships between variables, and then experimental is actually manipulating and not just measuring different variables and seeking a cause. So if I change a certain variable, does it cause another variable to change or not to change? So those are really carefully crafted experimental conditions, usually in a lab, because that can really be controlled, but it can be in the field as well. So some of the methods of research are as follow. a case study is studying one person or group in detail. Like if someone has something really interesting and kind of unique about them, you can study that to learn more. Those are kind of rare though, because in general, when you're doing research, you're trying to generalize the results so that you can make predictions based on your results. So you're not going to get a lot of great info to be able to generalize to a bigger population from just one person, but they can be really interesting studies to provide detail about, a particular condition or something like that. Observation is just watching, so it's just tracking people's behavior either in a lab or in a natural environment, just kind of seeing what people do in a particular situation. You can make predictions about maybe how they'll react to something, but it's just watching and seeing what happens. Surveys, you're probably super familiar with, taking lots of surveys, either kind of interviews, if you've ever been to the mall and someone has tried to stop you and ask you questions, or called. Most of us don't really answer the phone anymore when that happens. So now there are a lot of surveys on the internet. So you get lots of customer service surveys after you've had a service experience. The assessments that we did last week are surveys. They're kind of descriptive of your state. So your negative affect, your positive affect, your subjective well-being at a particular time. You're answering questions and kind of rating about those. Those are self-report. That's when you report them. Those are kind of the easiest way to gather information, but there's some challenges with those. We have like sometimes we kind of want to be a certain thing. So when you're taking maybe a personality test, you want to be perceived in a certain way. So you maybe answer questions not particularly honestly, but kind of more towards what you would hope to be. You also can report in ways that are not entirely authentic or not necessarily current. So one of the good things to do is have other people report. So that could be something for you to do if you're interested in the results of the assessments, and we'll be taking a whole bunch more. You'll be self-reporting, and you can have other people answer those for you. So if you asked someone who's really close to you or someone who can observe you about your positive and negative affect, would that match what you've reported for yourself? So content analysis is another way. That's a really interesting way because it kind of takes the self-report bias out of it. So an example of a content analysis where researchers are kind of combing through artifacts or communications looking for certain words. So there's a world well-being project going on right now, and there are researchers looking, with permission, of course, analyzing people's social media posts, so Twitter feed, Facebook feed, and they've defined certain words that fall into the positive category and certain words that fall into a negative category, so kind of optimistic, pessimistic, those sorts of things, and they're able to analyze those in communities and link them to different health issues. So communities that have higher levels of coronary disease tend to have to in their content, they tend to show more negative language. So some really interesting stuff about that because it's not, people are not conscious of that. It's kind of analyzing what they've said or done after the fact when they haven't intentionally changed what they're doing, knowing that they were in an experiment. Okay, so the experimental method, that's a controlled manipulation of variables in a lab or a field. You want to plan these really, really carefully. They're sometimes hard to have all of the conditions controlled, and so you can't necessarily make causal assumptions because you haven't been able to control for everything. But one of the smart things to do if you're testing a variable is to have a control group. So you have a treatment group and a control group. So the treatment group gets the treatment and the control group does not. And then you compare the results between those two groups. Random assignment means that people don't know which they're going to get. Double blind means that the researcher also doesn't know who's in which group. Let's say from Dr. Adler's experiments in implementing well-being skills in the classroom, the teachers who are the ones who are delivering that content don't know in advance who's getting what. And so there's less bias in terms of the researcher and kind of the deliverer of the treatment. And so that's considered the gold standard, is to have a randomized controlled experiment. That's considered to have the valid results. And so finally, there are statistical measures. Statistics, which can be hard to say, can be used to make sense of data. And so this is getting pretty sophisticated in terms of what we're learning in this class, but I want you to just kind of understand the definitions of all of these. And if you're interested in it, if you're really good at math, you love data, then this would be really exciting for you to learn more about. But there are two types of statistical measures that are applied to psychological research. The first is descriptive. Descriptive statistics help to describe and summarize the data with graphs, words, numbers that indicate the middle and the spread of the data. So data has a tendency to gather towards the middle, and we'll talk about this a little bit in a second. And so that's interesting to look at, and then also to look at the range of data that there might be from that middle or median score. Inferential statistics, on the other hand, actually go farther than describing and summarizing, and they take what we know about a sample to infer or to generalize about a larger population using the concept of probability. So we take this sample, the smaller sample size, and we learn about them. We kind of describe the data as it came out from whatever research we're doing, and then looking at generalizing that across a larger population. What's the probability that this would be true to the larger population? So descriptive statistics, these are some terms to become familiar with. The measures of central tendency, that's what's in the middle, and you saw in the video that it's described graphically by a bell curve. So a normal distribution is a bell curve. What most of the values are close to the average or the middle value. And if data is positively or negatively skewed, that means most of the data is towards one end or the other of the graph, of the range. And so measures of variability, the difference between the highest and lowest values, is called the range. And then how much the values differ from the mean or the center, the average, is called the standard deviation. So inferential statistics ask, is it possible to make predictions about the general population based on these research results. And there are several tests. These again are pretty sophisticated, that you don't need to know how to do these for this class, but we want you to kind of understand, if you come across a study that uses these measures, exactly what they mean. So the correlation coefficient measures the relationship between variables. T-tests measure the difference between groups that are being looked at. And then analysis of variance, or ANOVA, measures interactions between one or more variables. So the kind of the two concepts that you would then look at is statistical significance. What is the probability that the result we got in our research was due to chance? So there's a measure called the p-value, and you'll see this in a lot of studies, is is that measure. So 0.05 is the cutoff for statistical significance. So that means if it gets a p-value of 0.05, that represents a 95% confidence level that the results are not due to error or to chance. So that's legit. That means it's good and it's significant and it's meaningful. The effect size measures the magnitude of the finding. So this is used to determine kind of the practical significance. If the effect size is not very big, then it can be statistically significant that it's not due to chance, but it also just might not have a very big impact. So let's say students were taught the skill of perseverance, so how to stick with things. And when that was added, it had an impact on their test scores, and it showed a p-value that was statistically significant. But the impact on their scores was only 3 points. So that's not huge, right? I mean, that's not like a whole grade. So you want to take a look at both of those things when you're determining the impact of the research. So let's go back to our example now that we have all of that great information, and look again at this abstract that before looked really, really confusing, but now kind of makes a little bit more sense since we've been introduced to some of these research concepts. So we asked the question, can well-being be taught at a large scale, and should it be taught in schools? Does teaching well-being improve academic performance? And so you can see in the abstract, Dr. Adler describes 3 different studies. So the first one included 18 secondary schools, and the N is the number. So the number of participants was 8,385 students in Bhutan, randomly assigned to a treatment or control group, which is one of the strongest and most sophisticated types of research design. So they received an intervention. Study 2 replicated the study from Bhutan, but on a bigger scale, with 70 schools and almost 69,000 students. And then the third study was again a replication, meaning he was trying to replicate the results that he found in the first study to make sure that they were reliable, so they were reproducible. So this took place in Peru in 694 schools with almost 700,000 students. So that's a huge number of participants in this study. And in all 3, the students in the intervention schools reported significantly higher. So the effect size was big, significantly higher, and they performed significantly better on national exams. So in all three studies, perseverance, engagement, and quality of interpersonal relationships emerged as the strongest mechanisms that trigger that higher well-being and the higher performance on the tests. So we feel safe with this huge number of participants in the study to be able to generalize that across other populations of students in other places, in other countries, in the US, and elsewhere around the world, that's what this is indicating, that it can be generalized independent of social, economic, or cultural context, that teaching well-being in schools at a large scale is both feasible and desirable. So that's a pretty amazing study. That's why it was 110 pages, is because it had so much research put into it. So that's all for today. Some of this takes a little while to sink in, and you're going to have a homework assignment that will ask you to read a really short research article and just look for and identify some of these components so that you can have another example and another context to put them into, and then think about how the results of that research, it's around well-being and daily happiness, how you might then take that research and apply it to yourself.